Hello, everyone. This is Amie Schleicher, Field Specialist in Livestock with University of Missouri Extension. Welcome and thanks for joining me. So for our beef cow-calf operations that calve in the spring, breeding season is underway or just around the corner. So here to talk about having the most successful breeding season possible is Dr. Jordan Thomas. He's an assistant professor and state beef reproduction specialist with University of Missouri Extension. Jordan, welcome and thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So before we get into our first topic today, I thought it might be nice, since you're one of our newer state specialists, to maybe share a little bit about your extension and research program.
Sure. So like you mentioned, I am newer to the faculty, and which feels odd to say because I feel like I've been here a really long time. I did my graduate program at the University of Missouri under Dave Patterson, and kind of taken the reins from him as the state beef reproduction specialist. So I have a research program primarily focused on, applied beef reproductive management systems, so control of the estrus cycle, artificial insemination, things like that. And then also have an extension program as well, of course. Work a lot with the Show Me Select Replacement Heifer program and some other programs around the state.
Great, thank you for sharing that. So getting into our topic of discussion for today, at one of our extension forage and livestock town hall virtual meetings that we had recently, you talked about how pregnancy rates could be especially important this year. You might share with listeners why you think that's the case.
Sure. So, pregnancy rates in a beef cow operation are really always important, of course. So it's hard to say that they're more important this year than ever before, because they're certainly always important. But I think where my head is at anyway is that in a year in which cull cow prices are likely to be pretty poor, depending on how the ground beef market and things like that go, we want as many cows pregnant as possible, right? I mean, we just really need to make sure we're bringing in as much revenue to the operation as possible, and while still being cost conscious. Really, pregnancy success, not just in terms of whether cows get pregnant, but when cows get pregnant in the breeding season, really ultimately determines a lot of the profitability of a cow-calf enterprise. Obviously, cost control is important. So it doesn't give you a license to go, have unreasonable cow maintenance costs all year round, just if you're getting high pregnancy rates. But it's also really hard to really break even, let alone turn a profit, if you don't have a pretty good reproductive management system in place. So there's kind of this dance, in a spring calving herd, and that's what I talked a little bit on that forage town hall meeting about, is in a spring calving system, which is really a winter calving system in Missouri in most cases. We're trying to get those animals calved out and then rebred essentially before the peak of summer heat, fescue toxicosis, and it's just a challenge. And so I was trying to talk about maybe some of those tips and tricks and management systems that we can use to actually get that done in the spring calving herd.
So what are some of those tips you'd suggest to producers to make sure they do have as successful of a breeding season as possible?
Yeah, so, if we want to get pregnancies established early in the breeding season, as early as possible, which is really our goal, right? Not just get them pregnant, but get them pregnant as early as possible at their earliest opportunity. There's really just two pieces that we have to make sure that we have in place. We have to have male fertility early on, and we have to have female fertility early on. But as simple as that sounds, it's kind of complex to get both of those things. So on the male side of things, there are a couple things that we can do. One is we can make sure that every bull's had a breeding soundness evaluation. So every bull that gets turned out, we know doesn't guarantee that he's fertile, but it at least can identify the ones that are obviously infertile and get those out of the system. So having a bull breeding soundness exam performed is super critical. My rule of thumb is you do that for every bull every single time that you turn them out. That's really what I would suggest. Another thing is make sure that you turn out adequate bull power, right? So we really need to think about what number of cows am I expecting this bull to cover, and is that appropriate for the age of that bull? So for a yearling bull, expecting that bull to cover more than, say, 12 animals is pretty ambitious. For an 18-month-old bull, 18 animals is probably a pretty safe expectation for 2-year-old bulls. I think you can move to that more typical 1 to 25 type of ratio. I always tell people, be really cautious about single sire paddocks where there's just one bull to cover all those females. It's not to say don't do that, but if you do it, you probably want to observe them a little bit and make sure that bull's actually getting the job done, and that you're not continuing to see just a massive amount of heat activity as that breeding season moves forward. So that's the male side of things. The other thing that I think we could talk about on the male side of things is, if you do an AI program, you service all of those females very early on, and you guarantee that every female at least gets serviced, for example, in a timed AI program at one time on one day on the first day of the breeding season. And a bull's just not going to do that. A bull's not going to service every female the very first day of the breeding season. And because of that effect of just synchronization and getting them all bunched up towards the beginning of the breeding season in an AI program, that can really be advantageous. Sometimes we say that half the benefit of an AI program is just the synchronization and the getting those females serviced early on. On the female side of things, as we think about getting fertility established early in the breeding season, those become more systems questions, right? Because we're talking about puberty in heifers, and we're talking about kind of what system do we have in place to cull later conceiving cows that are going to calve later and be less likely to be cycling.
So you've touched on a little bit already, but what are some of those common issues that come up during the breeding season as you work with producers from across the state?
Yeah, so, as we go through a breeding season, I think, again, there's always kind of this challenge. There's this dance that we're doing in a spring calving herd of trying to get pregnancies established early enough, because of how hot and humid our summers get in Missouri, and just the effects of heat stress on reproduction in not only the female, but also the male. And then also this little nagging annoyance that we have with fescue toxicity. So fescue, is infected with endophyte, and that endophyte produces some of these alkaloids that have negative effects on a lot of, physiological processes, but certainly reproduction and the ability to thermoregulate appropriately in order to maintain reproductive function and growth and intake and all of those things that we really need for good animal performance. Fescue is kind of a lingering just challenge that we have to deal with in our system, and we really start to have toxic effects of fescue in June, right? And so if we have a quote unquote spring calving herd, really a winter calving herd in Missouri that calves out around January, February, dealing with that effect in June really means we got to get animals conceiving as early as possible in that breeding season, if you think about the timeline. So that's probably our biggest just day in and day out challenge that we have to deal with in a cow-calf operation that does, quote unquote spring calving, winter calving. There's a lot of other little challenges though, right? I mean, yes, we're trying to suppress seed head formation in those fescue plants. We're trying to keep the forage vegetative. We're trying to do all of those things to really manage the dose of that toxin that the cows get. But we also have these challenges of, in the early spring, we're trying to maybe move heifers that have been on a TMR or on hay and supplement onto lush pasture, and how do we manage that transition so that we don't completely screw them up right at this critical time in which we're trying to get them bred. So there's a lot of kind of case-by-case recommendations that I think your livestock specialist, whether that's you or somebody from a different part of the state, your livestock specialist would certainly be able to maybe talk through some of the specifics of your operation. You're welcome to get a hold of me as well. But it's a little bit of this dance where we're trying to manage this system and make sure that we don't really wreck plain of nutrition going into that breeding season.
But so one of the topics that we've covered at some extension meetings, it seems like with increasing frequency these last few years, is the issues that some producers are having with open females, whether that's kind of a widespread thing or more of a, an individual operation situation. So what are some things that we can do to help prevent those issues, since, sometimes we don't know until after the fact and it's too late to be able to do anything? What can we do on the prevention side?
Yeah, so that's one of those big picture questions and kind of a systems question that I actually love to talk about because I think really reproductive performance of the cow is kind of a function of reproductive performance of the heifer and of the heifer selection practices that we have. So, so for example, there's a big difference between a replacement heifer that conceived in her first cycle and one that conceived on the last day of the breeding season. And so when we retain heifers that conceived so late in their first breeding season, essentially we're setting them up to fall out of the herd at an exceptionally fast rate. They're going to have a much harder time breeding back as a 2-year-old, and they're going to have an even harder time breeding back as a 3 and 4, and they'll just fall out of the herd on average so much faster. And the problem in the cow-calf business in general is just that it's such a long production cycle that we just don't connect that back to the heifer, but it's really the function of the heifers that we kept or purchased, right? If maybe we purchased a heifer that didn't really fit our system in terms of when she conceived. So I see it as a heifer problem, but it can also be a little bit of a cow problem in the sense that, you can take an early conceiving heifer and kind of screw up some management things, and she winds up being a late conceiving cow, right? So certainly managing nutrition in cows, managing, length of the breeding season, and having a really good culling program on cows is one way to solve this problem. So, for example, I don't really care that much about how long of a breeding season that a producer uses. If you want to expose bulls to cows for 120 days, that's your decision. But we can do a lot to manage length of the calving season, right? We can have a preg check done relatively early and have a fetal age determined, and then maybe instead of marketing these open cows, we're marketing bred cows that are worth a little bit more, but we can still manage for this kind of shorter calving season that we're trying to manage for. And that may be a really good strategy, honestly, in a year like this one where, the market kind of stinks right now, and maybe we can get some females actually bred and market bred cows, hopefully, later in the year after we're through some of this. Of course, we never know what that means and what it looks like, but thinking optimistically, maybe the market comes back a little bit and we have this opportunity to market some bred females that are bred, but they're just bred outside of the window that you want. So thinking about that culling criteria for cows in a profit-centered way, where I'm thinking about the fact that, this cow that conceived early is just worth a lot more to me than this cow that conceived way late. And this cow that conceived way late, I may even need to sell, quite honestly, even though she is pregnant.
Mm-hmm. So switching gears just a little bit, we've been focused on those winter or spring calving herds, but of course we do have some producers that have fall calving herds as well. So what are some specific recommendations for them, even though this is kind of the easier time of year for those production cycles, but what would you suggest for those folks with those fall calving cows?
Sure. Well, the first thing is probably don't roll your open females from the spring into your fall calving herd, and that's a big no-no for me, is allowing these females to switch herds as a function of falling out reproductively in one or the other. And it's tempting to do, and I realize it is tempting to do because we feel like we have this good, productive, maybe young female. When you start allowing that to happen, though, what you end up having is you have females that on average are producing one calf every 18 months instead of 12 months, and they just become really expensive calves to raise is really what happens. So that's the first one, is let's not, if you do have dual herds, maintain them as separate herds and make some of those culling decisions. Don't just dump your garbage, so to speak, into the other herd from the other. So just like you said, fall herds are maybe a little out of sight, out of mind right now. But a lot of what we do management wise right now is going to affect the reproductive performance of a fall calving herd. So it's a different kind of a dance in a fall calving herd. It's not that get them bred before summer heat. It's often get them bred before plane of nutrition really starts to go down in the winter. And so in a spring calving or winter calving herd in Missouri, where we're calving in, say, January or February and rebreeding in the true spring, forage is abundant, it's lush. Oftentimes we're just trying to manage it so the forage doesn't get too far ahead of us. In a fall calving system, it's quite a bit different. So there are a couple things that I think you can do. One is, again, these are kind of more forage recommendations, but from a grazing perspective, if you can be managing your grazing system now with stockpiling fescue on your mind, where am I going to be accumulating some stockpiled forage? Stockpiled fescue is about the best thing that you can feed cows, honestly, from a nutritional perspective. So if you have a big picture plan in place, or at least a planning process that you go through to try to leave some of that material that you can actually turn into stockpiled forage, and again, your regional livestock specialist could really give you some nice suggestions about how to manage that kind of a system. Having that plan in place or that goal in place now is really beneficial. From the hay side of things, let's be honest, most of our producers are going to feed quite a lot of hay, and probably are not going to stockpile as aggressively as maybe we would wish that they would on campus. But if you are going to make a lot of hay, or you choose to have hay be a big part of your management system, gosh, you probably ought to be cutting hay right now, quite frankly. If you go look through a lot of pastures in my part of Missouri, maybe less so up north, but we got a lot of grass that is really trying to get ahead of us already. And I sort of lean on Rob Kallenbach's old advice of plan to cut hay in April so that you maybe actually get it done in early May. and there's a lot of wisdom in that, because we put up way too much over mature hay all over the state of Missouri. And if you're going to put up your own hay and feed your cows that hay, just be mindful of the fact that in a fall calving herd, if you're really feeding a pretty low quality forage, you can really tank reproductive performance, because you need that nutrition pretty high around the time of breeding. And when we start to sink the plan of nutrition going into breeding season, we really sink reproductive performance too.
So Jordan, going forward, are there any resources that you would recommend to producers that might be helpful to them? And how can producers follow you and your work? You're doing some kind of cool stuff on the technology side of things. So that's a hint for one of the things I'd like for you to share with them, by the way.
Sure. So on that one, I think you're probably talking about, I have a YouTube channel and Facebook page and some things like that, that producers could follow. It's called MizzouRepro. Honestly, if you just Google MizzouRepro, stuff will pop up. And we try to put together some really short videos that walk through some of these technologies in terms of synchronization or artificial insemination, and also some of the concepts, of what does a calving distribution really look like, and interpreting some of that information. How does that affect profitability? We'll talk about some of those concepts too. So that's some of my stuff. There are also some really good resources that aren't Mizzou specific necessarily. So the Beef Reproduction Task Force is a national group of academics and industry folks that put together a sheet of protocols for cows and protocols for heifers every year on the synchronization side of things. So I would encourage you to check out those protocol sheets. They're typically in the back of an AI stud catalog, but you can also find them online pretty easily. There are some really good opportunities to use versions of those protocols for just natural service only herds too. So don't think that synchronization is just for artificial insemination. There's some really low cost, easy in terms of the number of animal handlings that you actually need to do, easy protocols that you could use, even if you do want to use your own bulls and only use natural service, can still really help you really improve the efficiency of your operation. There's also an Estrus synchronization planner tool that is really nice. I believe it's hosted on Iowa State, but you can find that through the Beef Reproduction Task Force website as well. And if you are, planning multiple groups of animals, it's sure nice to use a tool like that that can help you make sure you actually don't get all your dates crossed and do things on the wrong date. So I think that's all. I sure would appreciate you trying to connect with me online through that MizzouRepro page. And you can also ask me some questions there and send some messages in that way. I get a fair number of questions all the time. And believe it or not, on a Sunday afternoon, I don't mind answering your synchronization question or whatever. So sure, connect with me on there.
That sounds good. Thank you for sharing those. Well, Jordan, thanks so much for visiting with me today and sharing your expertise. I think you touched on a lot of key strategies that are going to be helpful to producers, um, help them with their bottom line, especially in a year like this that's shaping up to be quite challenging. So thank you again for your time.
No, thank you, Amie.
So thanks everyone for listening to this program from University of Missouri Extension, and I hope you'll join us again next time. Have a good day.